We are in the midst of the Hollywood classics, specifically some of the greatest Christmas movies ever made. Today is a classic that came out in 1946. A little bit of trivia for you. It was supposed to come out in 1947, but was rushed to come out a year earlier. And if you watch it, you will see some significant editing mistakes. That video that I shared with you that is 3 minutes long, it took me 2 months to edit it, and I have a computer. I cannot imagine what it's like snipping and painting and taping and doing all that editing work together, placing that together. But you will see some editing mistakes in it. It's a Wonderful Life was a dud at the box office. In fact, Frank Capra, whose name is listed on here, afterwards, he did one more movie, and then after that kind of left off into obscurity. Really didn't do anything. The movie was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, didn't win any. It was locked into a vault, and no one watched it. Didn't make any money. In fact, it lost money for the studio, all due to a loophole that allowed anyone to watch the movie for free. And so in the 1970s, when the networks were looking for a Christmas movie to play, they thought, hey, we've got nothing to lose. It's not going to cost us anything. And they started showing it about 20 times during the holiday season. Now, it's one of the great Hollywood classics. Now let's see a show of hands here. How many of you have seen It's a Wonderful Life? Well, guess what? If I would have asked that question 40 to 50 years ago, none of you would have raised your hands. Today, the AFI lists It's a Wonderful Life as the most inspirational film ever made. Here's the storyline. It's the Great Depression, and George Bailey, played by Jimmy Stewart, is in Bedford Falls. And his dad owns the building and loan, and someday his dad is hoping that George will take over the business. But George has got dreams. He has ambitions that go beyond Bedford Falls, but he feels this responsibility for others. Wow, doesn't that sound like a biblical concept? George Bailey graduates high school, and his dad passes away. And nobody is left to run the building and loans. So I want to pause right here and tell you about Henry Potter. Potter is not a nice guy. He runs, he owns the town, and since no one is willing to take over the building alone, this really unpleasant man is going to buy the building alone. And so Potter's aim is to close and consolidate that building alone with the bank that he now owns. And the decision lies squarely on George Bailey. If he doesn't set aside his dreams, take over the building alone, then the little guy of Bedford Falls is going to suffer. And so he chooses not to go to college, chooses not to travel the world, and stays in Bedford Falls. Now the clip that we're about to see is an interaction with his brother. And so he is really hoping that his brother would take over the building alone. But one of the things we're going to find is the character, and as my wife watched this, she says, boy, George is depressed. I mean, you really get a sense of the weight that he does not want to stay in town, but he does. So, after that scene, George Bailey gets married. And he is ready to go on a honeymoon. He has saved $2,000, which in today's money, that'd be $40,000. He's ready to go on a great adventure, see the world with his bride. But at that very moment, the Great Depression hits. There's a run on the bank and a run on the building alone. And Bailey realizes that if he doesn't stop it, it's all going to be over for his business. Let's watch. Now you're getting a sense of George's character. He cancels his honeymoon, uses his own money for the business, for the people of this building alone. And this spans the entire first half of the movie, telling this story. Now the climax of the film, which many of us think about, actually takes place 8 years later. It's 1946. World War II is over, it is Christmas Eve, and George Bailey is still running the building alone. And his heart's just not in it. It's not making a profit, and you can see that. And on Christmas Eve, Uncle Billy is depositing money into the bank. That's actually how the banking world works. The small bank usually keeps all the money in the big bank. And he is depositing $8,000, which is over $100,000 today. And Uncle Billy misplaces it. His action means that the building and loan is going to go under. And because George takes responsibility not only for the building and loan, but also for his Uncle Billy, George is going to go to jail for embezzlement. And George does anything he can to keep the business afloat. Anyone who can loan him $100,000 on Christmas Eve to keep him out of jail. By that evening, he's unsuccessful. He feels the world crashing before his eyes. He yells at his family. He goes to a bar on Christmas Eve, and he prays. And not getting the answer he wants, or needs, or feels like he needs, he comes up with his own. Let us watch. That seems a tough one. But you can't understand the film. You can't understand the movie. You can't even understand the Christmas message without it. And it strikes so close to home. Over my short career, I have officiated at 2 people for funerals who have successfully committed suicide. I've also visited quite a few people that have tried. Adam Hamilton, who is the pastor of a church in Kansas City, tells a moving story about how his grandma took her own life. He says that she prayed and hearing nothing, much like George Bailey, took her own life. I want you to think about Hamilton's story. I want you to hear the story of George Bailey. Because I don't want any of you leaving here today without hearing from God. If you are at that point, feeling the world crashing down around you and upon you, I want you to know, I want you to hear that suicide is not an answer. There is another way. God is saying, this is not what I want from you. Things seem dark right now. God is saying, you and me together, we will make it through it. Life is a gift, and I am not done with you yet. There is so much we can accomplish together. This is not my plan. This is not my path for you. Now, maybe you're not there right now. Someday you might be. Someday you may be looking into that tunnel with pain so deep, believing that your only option is this path. Our goal, our focus today is in that moment you remember anything from today's service is that the pastor said, this is not God's plan. This is not God's plan. George Bailey is not a coward. He's not weak. He just can't see another way. So he devises this plan. He's got $15,000 in life insurance, which is about $200,000 a day, and he thinks things would be better if he was dead than alive. The payout from that, the debt would be gone, and his family would be better off. Now, obviously, he's not thinking things clearly here, because we know there won't be a payout if there is a suicide. But we know in suicide, you're not thinking clearly, and it only makes the situation worse. Now, haven't we all been George Bailey? That's why this movie is so compelling. Maybe we don't have a plan, but we've all thought at some point in our life would be better if I was not here. In those moments, that's when we need someone to come along and give us a different perspective. And that's where Clarence comes in. The angel. Now, according to the story, he's an angel that needs his wings, and he's got a plan. And so he jumps into the water yelling, help, hoping and believing and thinking that George is going to respond. I mean, George postponed his honeymoon. George is going to postpone his suicide, right? And so George jumps in to save Clarence. So let's talk about angels for a minute. Do angels exist? Have any of you ever seen an angel? According to a really unique a survey that was done of non-church people, 40% of Americans who don't go to church still believe in angels. Now in the Bible, an angel just means a messenger. And it can be a human or an angelic being. And angels are only talked about in the Bible with two specific instances. When God wants to announce something earth-shattering, and when something is part of God's huge plan. God sends messengers that look like human beings. Now the idea of wings, like what you have here, or of Clarence getting his wings, that's not in the Bible. Now there are creatures in heaven that have wings, but they are not the messengers. But what do we find in the Bible? We find in the book of Genesis, Sarah is told by 3 people that she is going to have a baby. Now none of those people have wings, but it's a big announcement. Her baby is going to usher in the nation of Israel. Mary receives an announcement from angels about the birth of Jesus, all part of God's huge plan. An angel comes to Joseph about the birth of Jesus. Angels come on Christmas Day to speak to the shepherds. Angels show up at the resurrection to speak to the women that Jesus is not dead, but he is alive. Again, announcing big news. Now, angels also show up in a time of discouragement. In the wilderness, Hagar is, there's an angel with Hagar when she's kicked out of the home. When Elijah is there to pray to die. When Jesus is tempted by the devil for 40 days. And an angel appears to Jesus when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, probably his lowest point. In the book of Acts, angels appear with the disciples when they're in prison. An angel stands with Paul when he's facing execution. Adam Hamilton, in his 15,000 member congregation in Kansas City, asked his congregation to share some personal stories about angels appearing. He had 50 responses. One woman who had a newborn heard her grandma in the middle of the night say, "Wake up!" Now her grandma had been dead for years, but she heard it as plain as day, and when she woke up, she noticed that a pillow had fallen on her newborn's face, and when she pulled up the pillow, the baby gasped for air. Another story comes from what Adam Hamilton calls the human category. A woman was 8.5 months pregnant. Her 2 and her kids were driving down the car in the expressway, and a tire of the car blew out, and they pulled off the side of the road. Out of nowhere, a pickup truck shows up and helps change the tire. Here's the quote. Out popped an angel. The angel was a little greasy and dirty. He was a messenger from God. He announced good news of great joy and announced, "I have a hydraulic jack in my truck. I can change that real quick for you." And he did. And he drove away. Do you have experiences like that with an angel? Something that occurs at just the right moment. You may have just been a witness to a messenger from God. Let's listen to our passage of Scripture.
Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison, as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured, as though you yourselves were being tortured.
Thank you. Guess what? This happens all the time. Now remember, in this movie, God's angels look like you. When God wants something done, God doesn't send the heavenly ones, God sends the earthly ones. Your job is to notice when someone's back tire blows out. Or notice when you're in the grocery store and someone has $10 less than to be able to pay for those groceries, and you happen to have that $10. Pay attention. You just may bring joy to someone else. And in the process, feel joy as well. Well, as you might imagine, in the movie, George Bailey doesn't believe that Clarence is an angel. He continues to think that the world would be better off without him, and that's where we find the next plot twist in the movie. Let's watch. George literally gets his wish. What would the world be like without George Bailey if he never existed? Well, we see that in the film. Bedford Falls is now Pottersville. Henry Potter, that stinker of a banker, takes over the entire town and he reshapes it and renames it. The bar where George prayed on Christmas Eve has a different name. And he notices that everyone acts differently. He sees people he knew and watches how their lives turned out differently because George was not in it. Did not help them with a loan, did not help them with an act of kindness. One woman, an aspiring actress in the first part of the film, is now singing in a strip club, all because George was not there to encourage her. George, however, is still not convinced. Let's watch. Here's the title of the film. Don't you see, George? You did have a wonderful life. What a waste to throw it away. No wife, no kids. The truth is, George had an impact on all. Scientists call this chaos theory. They use the example of a butterfly, and researchers were able to prove that something so small as a butterfly flapping its wings in Asia was able to redirect the path of a hurricane. That small effect of air pressure, that cascading effect, had huge consequences somewhere else. Every one of you plays a role in God's plan. The people you touch, the things you do, each positive act has a cascading, rippling effect. You play a critical role. You are here to play a pivotal role in someone else's life. As long as you are breathing, you have something to do. You have something to fill. If you were not here, the absence of you would be a big hole. Now, as I was watching that film, I thought of a teenager from my first appointment. They were contemplating suicide. And I remember they were so low and so miserable and telling me that life would be so much better and so much easier if they just were not in it. Now, recently I talked with them on Facebook. And they told me that they couldn't even remember what that issue was about. Imagine that. 20 years later, what was the big deal? I've shared with you my fantasy. I would go back to the summer between my 7th and 8th grade years and I would change everything. My school years didn't go so well. I was scrawny. I did stupid stuff. And one time I was telling my daughter Cora about my dream, and she hit me flat. And she said, if you did that, I wouldn't be here. She's probably right. Everything had to happen for me to meet Sarah, and eventually to give birth to Cora, and to all of my children. One butterfly flapping their wings changes something else. I think of all the joys that I've missed. My wedding day, the birth of each of my daughters, watching each child go to school. Do you see how that works? You may not be a follower of Jesus Christ if this church didn't exist. You have touched 1,000 people and didn't even know it. Each little thing you do is the flapping of a butterfly wing. Or as Clarence says, each man's life touches so many others. In those moments of darkness, feel this is it. Feel that you can't go on. Reach out to somebody. My wife is a mental health practitioner. Now, she can't see you because she knows you, but she can recommend someone to you. Also, remember this number. No judgment, just someone to listen, someone to care. You can also reach for scripture if things aren't so bad. Psalm 23 says that God walks with us in those valleys of despair. When you're at your lowest, God wants to get a message to you. God is sending an angel to you now. Now, it probably is not going to look like Clarence, but it just may look like you. The very people offering encouragement. This is exactly what happens when George is in trouble. Mary calls up everyone in town, anyone, and says that George is in trouble and needs our help. Let's watch. It's okay to cry. I did watching that. This is an illustration of angels that God sends to help George. These were the very people that George helped during the course of his life. There are times that we cannot carry the burden all by ourselves. It's in those moments that we remember that Christ is Emmanuel, God with us. In the end, George is the richest person in town. The message is that your life matters. There are no hopeless causes. God is always with you. You are the angels offering encouragement. And when you become instruments of God, we find joy.